There is a particular kind of person that Soren Kierkegaard believed was in the most serious trouble of anyone alive. It is not the person in visible pain, it is not the one who is grieving or frightened or coming apart in a way other people can see. Those people, he thought, were comparatively fine. They had located their problem. They knew where it was. The person in the most serious trouble is the one whose life is working, employed, reasonably liked, gets through the week, has opinions, has plans, has a chair he prefers. Nothing is wrong. If you asked him whether anything was wrong, he would say no, and he would not be lying. And that is the whole difficulty, because Kierkegaard's claim is that this man is in despair and has simply never found out. That word is going to do an enormous amount of work over the next 2.5 hours, so let me take the ordinary meaning of it immediately. Despair, in his hands, is not sadness. It is not a mood, it is not a bad season, and it is emphatically not a medical condition. I am not going to use it as one, and nothing in this video is advice about your health. He is using the word the way an engineer uses the word fault. It describes a structural relationship that is out of true, and a structure can be out of true while feeling absolutely nothing about it, which is exactly why he says most despair is unconscious, and why he says, and this is the sentence that will run underneath everything else, that unconscious despair is not the mild version. It is the worse one. The man who knows he is in despair has, at minimum, found a thing. The man who has never suspected it is further away, not closer, because he is not even looking. Kierkegaard puts it like this: the specific character of despair is precisely this, that it is unaware of being despair. So, this is not a video about a melancholy Dane who told you to take a leap of faith. I want to deal with that phrase now, because it is the single most repeated thing attributed to him, and he did not write it. Not in that form. He writes about the leap, and he writes at extraordinary length about faith. The welded phrase leap of faith is a later English invention, and it does not appear in his work. That would be a footnote if the popular version meant the same thing. It does not. Leap of faith, as people use it, means believe anyway, close your eyes, override the evidence, jump. Kierkegaard's argument runs almost the other way. His point is that no amount of evidence ever turns into a decision by itself. You can gather reasons forever. Reasons are approximations, and an approximation, however good, is still an approximation. Between the best case you will ever assemble and the act of actually committing to something, there is a gap, and no further quantity of thinking closes it, because thinking is not the kind of thing that closes it. The leap is not what you do instead of thinking. It is what is left over when thinking has done every single thing it can do. And he does not reserve this for God. It is the structure of anything that requires you to be someone. You cannot be argued into loving a person. You cannot reason your way to the point where marrying them becomes the obviously correct output of a calculation. At some point, the calculating stops and you either do it or you do not, and whichever you choose, you did not derive it. Over the next 2.5 hours, I am going to build the whole of this man's thought in order the way he built it. We will start with the most seductive life available, the aesthetic life, and I will show you the strategy document its own inhabitant wrote for managing the one problem it cannot solve. It was written in 1843, and it describes an infinite scroll so precisely that it is uncomfortable to read. Then anxiety, which he separated from fear with a distinction nobody has improved on since, and which turns out to have no object at all. We will get to why the man standing at the edge of a cliff is not actually afraid of falling. Then despair proper, and the strange, clotted, famously unreadable sentence in which he defines the self, which I am going to argue is not bad writing but a specification, and which stops being funny the moment you read it as one. Then the crowd, and his claim that a crowd is untruth, not because groups are stupid, but for a reason about responsibility that no one had put that way before. And then what happened when he deliberately provoked a newspaper into destroying him in order to see whether he was right, and what it cost him, which was more specific and more personal than people realize. Then Abraham on the mountain with a knife and a son and no explanation available to him. In the book Kierkegaard published under the name Johannes the Silent, a book that spends 200 pages refusing to make that story comfortable. Then repetition, his least known idea, and the one I think is most useful, which points forwards rather than backwards, and which he was in the middle of writing when the woman it was secretly about got engaged to someone else, so he rewrote the ending while it was at the printer. Then the machine he built to prevent you from agreeing with him, because the major works are published under invented names who argue with each other, and at the end he signed a declaration acknowledging that he wrote them and asking in print that not one word be attributed to him. There is a reason for that, and it is not modesty. And then the last year, when he turned everything he had at the church he had grown up in, and the specific accusation he made, which was not that Christianity was false, but something considerably more awkward. A word about what kind of man wrote all this, because it matters for the parts where he sounds superhuman. He was not. He was born into a household under what his father believed was a judgment. 7 children, 5 of them were dead before he was. He appears to have expected to die before he was 34 and to have been genuinely thrown when he woke up on the other side of that birthday. He broke off his engagement to the one woman he loved, deliberately, and then wrote about it in code for the rest of his life. He spent his entire inheritance down to almost nothing, timed, whether he meant it or not, to run out at about the moment he did. He died at 42 in a hospital, having refused to take communion from a clergyman. And he produced, in roughly 13 years, a body of work about what it costs to become a person, which is still the most precise account anyone has written of the specific ways a human being avoids doing it. Let us start with the most attractive way. Part 1. The Rotation of Crops. In 1843, a book appeared in Copenhagen called Either/Or. Either or. It ran to 2 volumes, and it was, on the face of it, not written by Kierkegaard at all. The story the book tells about itself is this. A man named Victor Eremita, Victor the Hermit, buys a second-hand writing desk, an escritoire. He has wanted it for a while. He stares at it in the shop window. He finally buys it. Then one morning he is in a hurry. He needs money from the drawer. The drawer sticks. He loses his temper and hits the desk with a hatchet. And a hidden compartment springs open, and inside it there are papers. 2 sets of papers by 2 different men arguing for 2 irreconcilable ways of being alive. The first set belongs to a young man who is never named. He is called simply A. The second belongs to an older man, a judge, called B, or Judge William. And Victor Eremita, having found them, edits and publishes them and declines flatly in the preface to tell you which one is right. That is the book. That is the argument. The structure is the argument. Kierkegaard has built an object that does to the reader the thing it describes. It puts 2 entire lives in front of you and refuses to adjudicate, because a choice that someone else makes for you is not a choice, and the whole subject of the book is what it means to choose. Let us go into the first compartment. A is an aesthete, and I want to be careful with that word, because in English it suggests someone with a nice, flat and strong opinions about ceramics. That is not the meaning. To live aesthetically, in Kierkegaard's technical sense, is to organize your life around what is interesting. That is the whole criterion. Not what is good, not what is owed, not what you have promised, what holds your attention. And I want to say clearly, before I go anywhere near a criticism, that this is not stupid. A is not a fool. A is the most brilliant voice in the book. His writing is faster and funnier and more alive than anything the judge produces in reply. And Kierkegaard knew exactly what he was doing when he made the wrong life the better read. The first section is called diapsalmata, a word borrowed from the Greek psalms meaning something like refrains, and it is a scatter of fragments with no argument connecting them. Some of them are among the most quoted lines he ever wrote. What is a poet? A asks and answers. An unhappy person who conceals deep anguish in his heart, but whose lips are so formed that as sighs and cries pass over them, they sound like beautiful music. That is the aesthetic position stated perfectly. Suffering is real and suffering is material. It goes into the work. It gets shaped. And the applause you receive is for the shape, not for the suffering which nobody has actually touched. Elsewhere, he writes that his life is absolutely meaningless, and that when he considers its various epochs, it is like a word in a dictionary that has to stand for the opposite of itself. He writes that he does not care for anything at all, that he does not care to ride, the motion is too violent, does not care to walk, it is strenuous, does not care to lie down, because either he would have to stay lying down, which he does not care for, or get up again, which he also does not care for. In summary, he writes, I do not care at all. Now hold that against the diagnosis I gave you in the opening. This man is not invisible trouble. He is amusing. He is at parties. He has produced this exquisite little paragraph about not caring, and everyone who reads it thinks it is marvelous, and he is being eaten alive. And then, in the middle of the volume, comes the piece that made me want to build this whole video around him. It is called the rotation of crops. The title is agricultural. Crop rotation is what a farmer does so that a field is not exhausted by planting the same thing in it every year. You change what you plant, and the soil recovers, and you keep getting a yield. A takes this and applies it to a human life, and what he produces is a systematic, entirely serious, step-by-step method for the management of boredom. Because here is the thing he has worked out, and he has worked it out with total clarity. The aesthetic life has exactly one enemy, and it is not guilt, and it is not shame, and it is not loneliness. It is boredom. Interest is the fuel, and boredom is the fuel running out. So the entire practical problem of his existence is the maintenance of interest at a level where the machinery keeps turning. He opens by saying that boredom is the root of all evil, and he does not intend that as a joke. He runs it back through history. The gods were bored, so they created human beings. Adam was bored alone, so Eve was created. Then Adam and Eve were bored together. Then the whole family was bored. Then the population of the world increased and the peoples were bored en masse. And to amuse themselves, they conceived of building a tower high enough to reach the heavens, which, he says, is as boring an idea as the tower was tall. Then the method. Rule 1. Never commit. Commitment closes options, and an option once closed cannot be rotated. So no friendship of the binding kind, no marriage, no official position, nothing that will still be true of you in 10 years, whether or not it is interesting by then. Rule 2, and this is the one that made me put the book down. Cultivate forgetting as deliberately as you cultivate remembering. He is explicit. The art is not to have a good memory. The art is to be able to forget selectively, so that experience does not accumulate into something with a shape, because something with a shape has obligations attached, and obligations are the enemy of rotation. You want your past to be a supply of material, not a record. Rule 3. Change the crop before the soil gives out. Never let anything run until it is exhausted. Leave early. Leave while it is still good, because the thing you are protecting is not the relationship or the project. It is your appetite. Rule 4. Arbitrariness. And this is where it becomes something close to a confession. When the natural interest of a thing is used up, manufacture an artificial one. He gives an example. Go to the theatre and watch not the play but the middle of the actor's forehead, and attend to the single bead of sweat there. Or listen to a tedious man talking and attend only to the sound his shoe makes on the floor. Cut your attention loose from what the thing is actually about and attach it somewhere arbitrary, and you can get a yield out of a field that has nothing left in it. Read that again as a description of the last time you sat through something. I said this was written in 1843, and I want to be precise about the claim I am making, because it would be cheap to say a Danish writer predicted the smartphone. He did not. He had no idea. What he did was isolate the underlying mechanism, and the mechanism has not changed. If the highest criterion available to you is whether something is interesting, then your life becomes an attention management problem, and attention obeys a law of diminishing returns, and so the strategies required to keep it going must escalate. The novelty has to come faster. The commitments have to get lighter. The forgetting has to get more efficient. He is not describing a vice. He is describing an equation, and the equation only has one solution, and the solution is it does not work forever. Which brings us to how the aesthetic life ends. And this is where Kierkegaard breaks with almost every moral scheme you have encountered, so it is worth slowing down. The aesthetic life does not end because it is punished. Nobody comes for A. There is no reckoning and no consequence and no comeuppance. It also does not end because he is argued out of it. The judge writes him 2 enormous letters and they change nothing, and Kierkegaard knew they would change nothing, which is why he made them boring. It ends, if it ends, by collapsing under its own operation. The rotation gets faster and the returns get smaller, and at some point the man running the system notices that the system is the whole of his life and that there is nobody inside it. Not a moral discovery, a structural one. He has organized his existence so completely around not committing that there is now no self there to commit, because a self, in the argument we are coming to, is not a thing you are issued at birth. It is something that accumulates out of what you have bound yourself to. Refuse every binding, and you have not preserved your freedom. You have declined to exist. Kierkegaard's word for the moment this becomes visible is despair, and A does get there. At the very edge of the first volume, underneath the jokes, there is a line where the whole performance drops for a second. My soul, he writes, is so heavy that no thought can carry it any longer. That is the sound of a field with nothing left in it. So the obvious next question is the one the judge asks in the second volume. If the interesting is not enough, what is? And the judge has an answer, and it is a decent answer. And it is not the last word in this video, but it is the necessary next step, and it turns on a single verb. Choose. Not choose this or that, not choose correctly, just choose, because the judge's claim is that A has never actually performed the act at all. He has had preferences. He has had inclinations, tastes, enthusiasms, all of which happen to him. What he has never done is stand behind one of them in a way that makes him answerable for it afterwards. And the moment you do that, the judge says, something appears that was not there before. Not happiness, necessarily. Something more basic. A person with a history that belongs to them. Hold on to that, because in about 40 minutes, I am going to show you the sentence where Kierkegaard defines what that person actually is, and it is going to look like nonsense, and it is not. But first, we have to deal with what happens in the gap. Because between the life that will not choose and the life that has chosen, there is a feeling. Everybody has had it. Almost nobody can name it. And the reason they cannot name it is that they are reaching for the word fear. And it is not fear. Part 2. The Dizziness of Freedom. In 1844, Kierkegaard published a short, difficult, badly organized book called The Concept of Anxiety, under the name Vigilius Hafniensis, which means the Watchman of Copenhagen. It is not a comfortable read. It is written as a parody of a German academic treatise, complete with a solemn table of contents that the book then ignores. But buried inside it is a distinction that psychology took the better part of a century to catch up with, and which is still, as far as I can tell, the cleanest statement of the thing anyone has managed. Here it is. Fear has an object, anxiety does not. If you are afraid of something. A dog, a diagnosis. The conversation on Thursday, fear, is directed. It points. And because it points, it can in principle be dealt with. The dog is behind a fence, the results come back clear. Thursday happens and is survivable. The object is finite, so the fear is finite. Anxiety has no object, and Kierkegaard is not being loose here. He does not mean the object is vague or hard to identify or that you have not worked it out yet. He means there is no object. The thing anxiety is about is nothing. He says it directly. The object of anxiety is a nothing. Now, that sounds like word play until you notice what he does with it. Because if anxiety is not about a thing in the world, then it cannot be about your circumstances, and no rearrangement of your circumstances will resolve it. And this matches the experience exactly. Everybody has had the version of this where the life is fine and the feeling is there anyway, and where, crucially, sorting out the thing you had blamed it on does not remove it. The anxiety just relocates. It attaches to the next candidate. So what is it about, if it is not about anything? His answer is possibility. Anxiety is what freedom feels like from the inside before you have used it. The standing image is a man at the edge of a cliff, and this is where the whole thing turns. So I want to do it slowly. The man looks down. He feels the drop. And the ordinary reading is that he is afraid of falling. Kierkegaard says no. Falling is a fear, and it has an object, and it would be an entirely sensible thing to feel. But that is not the feeling that makes him step back from the edge with his heart going. The feeling that does that is the sudden, unwanted recognition that nothing in the universe is stopping him from stepping off, that it is available, that the decision is at this moment genuinely his, and that no law of physics or morality is going to intervene between the thought and the act. He is not afraid of the drop. He is afraid of himself. Specifically, he is afraid of the discovery that he is the kind of thing that could. And then Kierkegaard writes the sentence that I think is the most underrated line in 19th century philosophy. He says anxiety is a sympathetic antipathy and an antipathetic sympathy. Untangle it. Antipathy, you do not want it. Sympathetic antipathy, you're not wanting, is somehow on its side. Sympathy, you are drawn to it. Antipathetic sympathy, your being drawn to it is somehow against itself, which is to say, you are attracted to the thing you dread and repelled by the thing you are drawn to simultaneously. And that is not a contradiction to be resolved, but the actual internal shape of the feeling. Everyone has met this, and almost nobody has a name for it. It is the reason certain thoughts have a pull. It is why the possibility you find most appalling is also, in some unwelcome corner, the one you keep turning over. It is why people describe intrusive thoughts as feeling magnetic. The horror is not that the thought is there. The horror is that some part of you is leaning towards it, and you cannot find the seam between the part that leans and the part that recoils, because there is no seam. It is one feeling. He calls the total experience the dizziness of freedom, and the metaphor is exact and physical. Vertigo is not caused by height, it is caused by the eye failing to find a fixed reference. You look down and there is nothing at the right distance to lock onto, and the system that keeps you upright loses its footing. Kierkegaard's claim is that this happens with possibility as well. When you look into what you could do, there is no fixed reference in it. Possibility, by definition, has not been settled by anything, and the machinery you use to stay upright as a person swims. Then the line, freedom looks down into its own possibility and grasps at finiteness to hold itself up. That is what the step back from the edge is. It is not cowardice. It is a person reaching for something finite, a rule, a habit, a role, a job title, a firm opinion, anything with edges. Because the alternative is to keep standing in front of an unbounded number of ways your life could go, and no human nervous system can hold that open for very long. And now, the part that separates his account from the version you will find anywhere else, which is that he does not think this is a defect. Anxiety, for Kierkegaard, is not a malfunction. It is the sensation of having a capacity, and he draws the conclusion that follows, which is genuinely counterintuitive, and which he states without softening: the more spirit, the more anxiety, not less. More. A creature with no freedom has no anxiety, and he means that literally, he says an animal cannot be anxious, because an animal is not standing in front of its own possibility. Anxiety is the price of being the kind of thing that can do otherwise. So, the presence of it is not evidence that something has gone wrong with you. It is evidence of the faculty. Turn the volume down far enough, and what you have removed is not the discomfort, it is the range. Which is why he ends the book in a place nobody expects. He argues that anxiety is a teacher, and that it is in fact the most demanding and most honest teacher a person can have, and that being taught by it is a skill. The formulation is, whoever is educated by possibility is educated according to his infinitude. Look at what that says. If you are educated by finitude, by the actual things that happen to you, you learn a set of specific lessons of a specific size. This went wrong, so avoid that. That person hurt me, so watch for that. Useful and bounded. But a person schooled by possibility has had to stand in front of everything that could occur, including everything terrible, and has not been permitted the relief of knowing which of it is coming. And what that produces, in his account, is not a nervous wreck. It is somebody who is very hard to ambush. Because here is the trade. The person who has never let anxiety teach them anything is depending on things turning out roughly as expected. That dependency is invisible while it holds. And Kierkegaard's line about it is brutal and I think correct. He says that whoever is educated by finitude lets go of anxiety when the finite deceives him, and the finite always eventually deceives him. He goes further. He says that anxiety, when it is allowed to do its work, discovers every finite thing you have been leaning on and takes it away in advance. It rehearses the losses, so that when an actual loss arrives, you have already been somewhere in the region of it. Not that it will not hurt, that you will not be discovering, at the same moment, both the loss and the fact that losses are possible. He puts it in a phrase. He calls it being educated by possibility to have faith. And in his vocabulary, faith is not belief in a proposition. We will get to it properly in part 3, but the short version is that faith is the state of not needing the finite to hold, which is exactly what a person schooled in possibility has practiced. There is one more distinction in this book that I want to give you, because it is the one that keeps this from becoming an anxiety is secretly good pep talk, which it is not. He separates anxiety from what he calls shut-upness. In Danish, indeslatteth closed-upness, the state of being sealed, and he defines it very precisely as the unfreely disclosed. A person in this state is not silent because they have chosen silence. They are silent because they have lost the ability to open, and the interior has continued running without anyone else in the room. And then he says the thing that makes it stick. He says that the shut-up person is not afraid of being harmed. They are anxious about the good, anxious about disclosure, about being got at, understood, reached, because being reached would mean the sealed thing has to come out, and it has been in there long enough that bringing it out now would cost more than keeping it. That is a 19th century Dane describing, with no clinical vocabulary available to him whatsoever, the exact mechanism by which someone declines help they can see, want, and are being offered. So we have the aesthete who cannot commit, and we have the feeling that stands in the doorway of every commitment. What we do not yet have is an account of what is actually damaged when a person spends a life avoiding the doorway. For that we need the strangest book he ever wrote and the strangest sentence in it. It was published in 1849 under a name he had not used before, and it opens with a definition of the self that is regularly held up as proof that continental philosophy is a confidence trick. I am going to defend it. Part 3. The Sickness Unto Death. The book is called The Sickness Unto Death. It came out in 1849, and the name on it is Anticlimacus. I will come back to that name in part 7, because it is one of the most revealing decisions in the whole authorship, and it deserves its own section. For now, one fact about it. Anticlimacus is described as a Christian to an extraordinary degree, so high a position that Kierkegaard, who invented him, explicitly said he could not occupy it himself. He put his own name on the title page as editor, not as author, as the man who found the manuscript and thought you should see it. So, the definition, the self is a relation that relates itself to itself, or is that in the relation that the relation relates itself to itself? That sentence is famous the way a car crash is famous. It gets quoted in lists of impenetrable philosophy. It has been read aloud on stage for laughs. And I want to make the case that it is not obscure at all, that every word in it is load-bearing, and that once you see what it is doing, you cannot unsee it. Start with what it refuses to say. It does not say the self is a thing. It does not say the self is a soul, or a spark, or a personality, or a set of traits, or the person you really are underneath. Every one of those would make the self a noun, an object you have that could in principle be located, discovered, found, or expressed. He says the self is a relation. And then, because relation is still too static, he corrects himself inside the same sentence, not the relation, but the relating, the activity. The self is not the two ends and not the line between them. It is the ongoing work of holding them together. What two ends? He gives them in the lines that follow, in pairs, the infinite and the finite, possibility and necessity, the eternal and the temporal. In plainer terms, everything you could be, and everything you actually and unchangeably are, the open and the given. You are both permanently, and they do not agree. You have possibility. You could move country, change work, stop speaking to someone, start something at 50. And you have necessity. You were born in a particular body, in a particular decade, to particular people, and there are years behind you that are not going to be different, and there are limits that are simply true, and the self is not either of those. The self is what happens when the two are held in relation by you continuously as an act, which means it can be done badly. That is the entire point of the definition, and it is why he wrote it so carefully. If the self were an object, it could only be present or absent, healthy or damaged. Because it is an activity, it can be performed out of true, and his word for a self performed out of true is despair. He calls it a misrelation, not a mood, a misrelation, the relation relating itself wrongly. And now the whole thing opens up, because there are only so many ways to get a two-term relation wrong, and he goes through them like a fault tree. You can collapse into possibility. This is the person who is all potential and no ground. Everything is upcoming. The real life is the one that starts after the move, after the course, after the thing resolves. He is generous about how pleasant this can feel from inside. Possibility is intoxicating, and a person living in it is often the most interesting one in the room. But he says something exact about where it ends. The self runs out into possibility until there is no necessity left to come back to, and what looks like an abundance of futures is a person who has never once landed. He calls it memorably drowning in possibility. Or you can collapse into necessity. This is the opposite fault, and it is far more common and much quieter. This is the person for whom nothing is open, not because they have decided anything, but because the question stopped being live. The job is the job. The marriage is the marriage. The character is the character. I am just like this, I have always been like this, everything is settled, and nothing was ever chosen. Kierkegaard says of this person that they have, in effect, no self at all. They have a set of circumstances wearing a name. And then he says the thing about this second type that is the reason I built the opening of this video the way I did. He says that this is the form of despair which attracts the least attention in the world, that a person can live in it for a lifetime and be considered by everyone, including themselves, to be doing well, because it produces no symptoms. It produces a functioning citizen. He goes further, and this is the passage that should make anyone uncomfortable. He says that this kind of person can lose a self so completely and so quietly that the loss is never noticed, and then he adds the detail that does the damage. He says that any other loss, an arm, a leg, $5, a wife, would be noticed immediately. The self is the one thing that can go missing without anybody filing a report. Now the 3 grades, which is how the book is actually organized. The first is the despair of not being conscious of having a self. This is the man from the opening. Nothing is wrong. He is not in pain. He is not in conflict. He would not recognize a word of this description. He has never had the thought that there is a question here. Kierkegaard's verdict on him is the one I quoted at the start, and it is worth repeating now that we have the machinery. This is not the mildest case. This is the deepest one, because despair is a misrelation, and this man is not relating at all, and you cannot correct a relation that has not been noticed. The second is the despair of not wanting to be oneself. Weakness. This is the one people can feel. It is the wish to be someone else, or to be somewhere else, or to have had a different set of facts. It is the daydream in which the humiliating thing did not happen. And notice that this is a step forward, not backward, because there is now something being refused, and a refusal implies a relation. It hurts more, and it is closer to health. The third is defiance, the despair of wanting to be oneself, but on one's own terms, with no reference to anything that established one. This is the person who has looked at the given and decided to be the sole author, and Kierkegaard is careful, because from outside this looks exactly like strength. It looks like self-authorship, and self-authorship is the highest value most people you know were raised on. His objection is not that it is arrogant. His objection is structural. A self that insists it is its own foundation is trying to be one end of the relation while pretending the other end is not there, and it will therefore have to spend its whole life fighting the given, which is undefeated. He has a phrase for what this collapses into, and it is one of the most modern-sounding things in the book. He describes a self that has become a king without a country, ruling over nothing, sovereign, and with nothing to be sovereign over. So that is the fault tree. Now the part that is easiest to get wrong. What is the opposite of despair? Almost every answer people give is one of happiness, contentment, confidence, peace, or simply not being in despair. Kierkegaard rules all of them out. Not being in despair is not the opposite of despair. in the same way that not currently having a fever is not the opposite of illness. It may just mean the thermometer is in the drawer. His answer is faith. And I need to define it his way, because if you import the ordinary religious meaning here, the argument disappears. He gives it as a formula, and the formula is structural. In relating itself to itself and in willing to be itself, the self rests transparently in the power that established it. 3 parts. Relating itself to itself. The activity is running. You are actually doing the work of being a person rather than drifting. Willing to be itself. You are not trying to be someone else, and you are not refusing the facts you were given. And resting transparently in the power that established it, you are not claiming to be your own source. Kierkegaard is a Christian writer, and by that last clause he means God. And I am not going to pretend otherwise or launder it into something more comfortable, but I want to be exact about what the structure requires. Because the structure is doing work that survives the disagreement. The claim is that a self cannot found itself, that the attempt to be the sole author of your own existence is not heroic, but incoherent, because the authoring thing would have to precede itself. Whatever you think established you, and he has an answer he is quite clear about, the state he is describing is one where you are not at war with the fact that you did not make yourself. Rest is the operative word. Not achieve, not conquer, rest. And here is what I think is the most useful single consequence of the whole book, and the reason I said in the overture that this is not a mood. If despair is a feeling, then the absence of the feeling is the cure, and the entire project of your life becomes feeling management. Distraction counts as progress. Numbness counts as progress. Anything that gets the reading down is a win. And you can run that program for 40 years. If despair is a misrelation, then feeling nothing is not evidence of anything at all. The question stops being, how do I feel, and becomes something you can actually inspect. Which end am I collapsed into? Am I living entirely in possibility and never landing? Am I living entirely in necessity and calling it realism? Am I refusing the facts of my life? Or am I insisting that I invented them? Those are answerable. You can look at your week and tell, and the answer might be that nothing is wrong. Kierkegaard would say that is precisely the answer to be most careful with, and that a person who is quite sure the question does not apply to them is the one it applies to most. There is one more thing about this book that I have to say, and then we move. He calls it a sickness unto death. And the phrase comes from the Gospel of John, where Jesus says of Lazarus that this sickness is not unto death. Kierkegaard takes the phrase and inverts it. Despair is the sickness unto death, he says. And then he explains that he does not mean it kills you. He means the opposite. The torment of despair is precisely that it cannot kill you, that its agony is to be unable to die. What is dying in this condition is the self, and yet it does not manage to die, and so the thing goes on. He calls it dying death itself, and he calls it the impotence of self-consumption. That is a bleak sentence, and I am not going to soften it, because the whole argument depends on the condition being serious. But notice what it also implies, which is the only hopeful thing in the chapter, and it is genuinely hopeful. If the self cannot be destroyed, then it is still there in every one of those failure modes. The man drowning in possibility still has it. The man buried in necessity still has it. It is not gone. It is out of true, which means the work is not construction, it is correction. Now, we have been talking about a single person and their internal structure for an hour, and Kierkegaard is well aware that this sounds like a recipe for the most self-absorbed life imaginable. So it is worth going to what he says about other people and about groups and about the specific arithmetic of what happens to a person's responsibility when you put them in a large enough room. Because he has a claim about that too, and it is the most quoted and least understood thing he ever wrote. Part 4. The crowd is untruth. The sentence is, "The crowd is untruth." In Danish, mængden er usandheden, and it is almost always deployed as though it means people are sheep, as an elegant way of saying that the masses are stupid and you, the person quoting it, are not. That is not the argument. Kierkegaard says explicitly that he is not talking about whether a crowd is composed of good people or bad people, clever people or idiots. He says you could assemble a crowd entirely out of the wisest and most decent individuals available, and the claim would still hold, because the claim is not about the quality of the members. It is about arithmetic. Here is the mechanism. A crowd, he says, renders the individual completely impenitent and irresponsible, not less responsible, not diluted. He is making a stronger claim than dilution. He is saying that responsibility does not survive the division at all. Think about how it actually distributes. Something is done by 200 people. Ask any one of them afterwards what they did, and the honest answer is a 200th of it. And a 200th of an act is not a small crime. It is not a crime at all. It is nothing. It does not reach the threshold at which a person recognizes themselves as having done something. So each participant walks away holding a fraction that is beneath the resolution of conscience, and the act, which definitely occurred, is owned by nobody. His example is the one that would have been available to any reader in Christian Europe, and he uses it deliberately because it is the hardest case. He points out that Christ was not crucified by a villain. He was crucified by a crowd, a procedure in which everybody involved had a piece so small that no individual had to be a murderer for a murder to take place. The soldiers were following orders. The governor was managing a situation. The priests were protecting an institution. The people in the square were shouting, and shouting is not killing. And Kierkegaard's point is that if you had gone round that crowd one at a time and asked each person privately whether they were prepared to do this thing, most of them would have said no. The crowd did what no member of it would have done. Now put that next to the account of the self from part 3, and you can see why he cares so much. Because it is not really a political claim. It is a structural one. A self, in his definition, is a relating that has to be performed by somebody. Responsibility is the load-bearing element. It is what makes an act yours rather than an event that happened near you. Remove ownership of the act, and you have removed the thing that a self is made of. That is why he calls the crowd untruth rather than immoral. Untruth. It is a machine for producing acts with no author, and a person inside it is temporarily not a person in the sense he means. Then the corrective, which is the other half, and which almost never gets quoted alongside it. He says that the individual, in Enkelte, that single individual, is the category through which everything must pass. And he asked for that phrase on his gravestone, or near enough. He wrote more than once that if he had to have an epitaph, he would want only that individual, not the great individual, not the exceptional one. That single individual, meaning whoever is currently reading this, one at a time with nobody else in the room. His entire authorship is addressed that way on purpose. He writes in the prefaces to the upbuilding discourses that he is looking for that single individual whom he, with joy and gratitude, calls his reader, singular. He is trying to get you out of the room before he says anything. And that is the point at which this stops being theory, because in 1846 he ran the experiment on himself. The Corsair was a satirical weekly in Copenhagen. It was widely read, it was feared, and it was known for going after public figures in a way that was very funny if you were not the target. Its editor was Mayor Aron Goldschmidt, who privately admired Kierkegaard enormously. What happened is not what people usually assume. Kierkegaard was not ambushed. He picked the fight. There was a critic named P.L. Moller, who had written a piece about Kierkegaard's work and who also, anonymously, contributed to the Corsair while pursuing a respectable university appointment. Kierkegaard published a response that did two things. It dealt with the criticism and it named Moller as a Corsair man, which was professionally damaging in exactly the way it was designed to be. And then, in the same period, he published an invitation. He said, in print, that it must be very hard to be singled out for praise by the Corsair and asked to be abused by it instead. He asked to be attacked. He got what he asked for. The paper turned on him and did not let go for months. And the attack was not about his ideas, because ideas are hard to make funny. It was about his body. The caricatures went after his thin legs, and the fact that his trouser legs were said to be of unequal length, his stoop, his hair, the way he walked, week after week in a small city with pictures. And it worked in the specific way that public mockery works. It got into the street. School children shouted after him. People he did not know had an opinion about his trousers. He became, in a city of about 120,000 people, a recognizable joke. Here is why that cost him more than it would cost most people. And this is the part I find genuinely sad rather than merely instructive. Kierkegaard did not write in a study in the sense that mattered. He composed by walking. Copenhagen was small enough to cross on foot, and he crossed it constantly, stopping to talk to whoever he met, shopkeepers, acquaintances, strangers. He called these his people baths. He would go out, talk to 40 people, come home and write. The walking and the talking were not a break from the work. They were the intake mechanism for it. The Corsair took that away. Not by censoring him. He could publish whatever he liked, and he did, at an incredible rate. It took it away by making a walk through Copenhagen into an event. You cannot take a people bath when the people are looking at you. So the man who wrote that a crowd is untruth and that the individual is the only category that matters proved it by arranging to be destroyed by a crowd and lost the daily practice that his work depended on. And he did not treat it as a disaster. He treated it as data. His journals from the period are in places almost cheerful about it. He writes about it as a confirmation, as the thing he expected. He also writes elsewhere with real bitterness about the loss of the street. Both are true at once. That combination, having proved your thesis and being unable to enjoy it, is very hard to fake, and it is one of the reasons I trust him more than I trust most philosophers on this particular subject. There is a second target in this section of his work, and it has aged even better than the first, which is his account of the press. He writes about what he calls the public, and he is precise that the public is not the same thing as a crowd. A crowd is physically present. It is a mob in a square. The public is worse because the public is an abstraction. It is nobody. It is a phantom that exists only because there is a medium capable of addressing everyone at once. And the reason it is worse is that a crowd eventually goes home and the public never does. And he identifies what the public does to speech, which is the bit that is unnervingly current. He says that where there is a public that must be addressed continuously, what is produced is not conversation but chatter. His word is snack, and his definition of chatter is precise, and it is not simply talking too much. Chatter is speech, in which the distinction between speaking and keeping silent has been abolished. That is the whole diagnosis in one clause. Not that people say stupid things, that the option of saying nothing has been removed so that speech no longer indicates that anyone had something to say. When silence is not available as a choice, words stop carrying the information that someone chose to use them. He also describes something he calls leveling, which is the process by which an abstraction with no author grinds down anything that sticks up, and he notes the peculiar cruelty of it. There is nobody to appeal to. A tyrant can be overthrown, he says, but the public cannot, because it is not anybody. You cannot argue with it, you cannot meet it, and it feels no remorse. Because remorse requires a person, and we established at the beginning of this section that the whole function of the arrangement is to make sure there is not one. I want to be careful not to turn Kierkegaard into a commentator on things he never saw. He is describing the Copenhagen newspaper world of the 1840s, a city where a handful of papers reached everybody who mattered. But the mechanism he isolated has nothing to do with the technology. It is responsibility divides to zero, silence stops being an option, and there is no one to hold accountable. Those three conditions can be met by a printing press, and they can be met by other things. And his prescription follows straight from the diagnosis, which is why it is not a call to withdraw from public life, though it is often read that way. He is not telling you to become a hermit. He lived in the center of a capital and talked to everyone in it. He is telling you that there is exactly one place where responsibility does not divide, and that is in the single individual, one at a time, in a situation where the act is unmistakably yours. which is a good place to introduce the hardest case he ever constructed. Because there is a story in which one man is alone with a decision that nobody can share, nobody can approve, and nobody can even be told about, and Kierkegaard wrote a whole book about it under a pseudonym, meaning the Silent One, and he wrote it so that the story would never be comfortable again. Part 5. The Man Who Could Not Explain. Fear and Trembling was published in 1843 under the name Johannes the Silent, John of the Silence. That choice is not decoration. The book is about a man who cannot speak, written by an author who has named himself after the fact. The story is from Genesis. Abraham is told to take his son Isaac to a mountain in the land of Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering. He gets up early. He saddles the donkey. He splits the wood for the fire himself and carries it 3 days. On the 3rd day he lifts his eyes and sees the place from far off. He tells his servants to wait. He puts the wood on the boy's back and takes the knife and the fire in his own hands, and they walk up together. Isaac asks where the lamb is. Abraham says God will provide it. They reach the top. He builds the altar, lays the wood in order, binds his son, puts him on it, and reaches out his hand and takes the knife. And then the angel stops him. That story is read to children. Kierkegaard's book exists to make it impossible to read it that way ever again. He begins with a preface complaining that everybody in Copenhagen has gone beyond faith. Everyone treats faith as the easy first stage that a serious person moves past on the way to philosophy. And he says, in that case, nobody here has understood the story. Because if you have understood it, you are not calm. Then he does something extraordinary. Before any argument, he writes 4 short variations on the story, 4 ways it could have gone. They are barely a page each, and they function like a musician playing a phrase 4 times to show you what is missing. In the first, Abraham cannot bear for Isaac to lose faith in God, so he turns and makes his own face terrible and says, I am an idolater, this is my desire, not God's. Better the boy should think his father a monster than that he should stop believing. He takes the horror onto himself. In the second, he does it. The angel stops him, and everything is externally fine. And Abraham never recovers. He goes home, and his eyes are changed, and he never sees joy again. In the third he does it, and afterwards he cannot forgive himself for having been willing, and he rides out alone to beg forgiveness for the sin of having consented. In the fourth, he reaches for the knife, and his hand shakes, and Isaac sees it. And Isaac loses his faith, not because of what his father did, but because he saw him falter. 4 humanly comprehensible Abrahams. Each of them is a man you can imagine, sympathize with, and account for. And Kierkegaard's point in putting them first is, none of these is the Abraham in the book. The one in the book does the thing and gets Isaac back and receives him with joy, and there is no residue and no trauma and no bitterness, and that is exactly what nobody can explain. Now, the 2 figures the book is built on, and this distinction is the reason to read it. The first is the knight of infinite resignation. This person is capable of the largest sacrifice a human being can make. They love something absolutely. They lose it or give it up. and they give it up completely. They do not bargain, they do not keep a corner of hope alive, they make the full renunciation and they hold it. Kierkegaard's example is a young man who loves a princess he can never have. The night of resignation converts that love into something eternal. He keeps it perfectly, forever, as a memory that can no longer be damaged because it is no longer expecting anything. And Kierkegaard says something surprising here. This is a genuine achievement. It is not a consolation prize. Infinite resignation is peace, real peace, and it can be reached by anyone who has the courage for it. He says he can make this movement himself. He describes it as something he can do. The second figure is the knight of faith. And this one does something that Kierkegaard says flatly he cannot do and cannot understand. The knight of faith makes the identical renunciation, gives the thing up totally, no reservation, and then in the same motion receives it back, not as a hope, not as a probability. He expects concretely in this life to have the princess. Abraham gives Isaac up entirely and simultaneously believes he will not lose him. Both, at once, with no contradiction managed and no tension released. Kierkegaard calls this the movement on the strength of the absurd, and by absurd he does not mean silly. He means it does not compute. The double movement cannot be assembled out of reasons, and the person doing it cannot show you their working. Then the detail, that is the best thing in the book. Johannes the Silent says he has been looking for a knight of faith his whole life and has never met one, and then he describes what one would look like if he found him. He would look like a tax collector. He says that if he encountered such a man, he would examine him closely, look for some crack, some hint of the infinite in his bearing, a distant look, a sadness, and find nothing. The man is solid. He belongs completely to the world. He goes to church. He enjoys his walk home. He takes pleasure in watching the crowds. He is a shopkeeper on a Sunday afternoon. He goes home and, on the way, thinks with real enthusiasm about the hot meal his wife has waiting, roast lamb's head with vegetables, in the example, and if she has not made it, he is not disappointed for a moment because he is exactly as content either way. Not a trace of it shows, nothing about him signals depth. Consider what that does to a very common idea. The spiritual life in most of its popular forms is legible. It comes with an appearance, a certain calm, a certain distance, a way of talking. It is a look, and Kierkegaard's most exalted figure is specifically and deliberately indistinguishable from a man who thinks about dinner. If there is anything to see, it is not the thing. The knight of resignation, by contrast, is easy to spot. Kierkegaard says you can recognize him at once. His gait is light, but there is something in it, a foreignness, a slight distance from the world, and above all the sorrow he keeps perfectly. The person who has given everything up beautifully looks like something. The person who has given everything up and taken it back looks like nobody. Now the hard part, which the book is actually named after, and which I am not going to smooth over. Kierkegaard argues that in this story, Abraham is doing something that cannot be justified in ethical terms. He calls it the teleological suspension of the ethical. The ethical is suspended for the sake of a higher end. In ordinary moral terms, the general rule that a father must not kill his son is the highest court there is. There is no appeal above it, and Abraham acts as though there were. This is not a loophole, and Kierkegaard does not treat it as one. He spends the book stress-testing it, and the test he applies is the one you should be applying, which is, how is this different from a man who murders his child and says he was told to? His answer is not comfortable, and I think honesty requires stating that it is not a knockdown. He distinguishes Abraham from the tragic hero, and the tragic hero is his control case. Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter so the fleet can sail. That is terrible, but it is comprehensible. He gives up one thing for a higher shared good. The nation, the army, and the community can weep with him because they understand the exchange. The tragic hero remains inside the ethical. He can explain himself. He has a language. Abraham has no such exchange. There is no nation being saved. The demand is addressed to him alone, and there is nothing to trade it against. Which produces the consequence the book is really about. Abraham cannot speak, not will, not cannot. Anything he says would be a translation of his position into the general, and his position is not general. If he says God told me to, he has made a claim that either enlists other people's agreement or invites their judgment, and either way, he has smuggled the thing back into the court he has stepped outside of, so he says nothing. He walks for 3 days beside a boy who trusts him and answers one question with a sentence that is true and reveals nothing. God will provide. 3 days of silence, carrying it. And that is the psychological content that survives even if you reject every theological word in the book. There are decisions that cannot be delegated, cannot be justified in advance, and cannot be explained to the people they most affect, not because you are hiding, but because the explanation does not exist in a form anyone could receive. Everyone who has made a genuinely consequential decision knows this specific loneliness, the leaving of a marriage that nobody watching thinks is bad, the refusal of the thing everyone agrees you should want, the staying when everyone says go. In each case, you can produce reasons, and the reasons are true, and they are not why. And the gap between the reasons you can give and the thing you are actually doing is exactly the space Abraham is walking through for 3 days. Kierkegaard's word for what has to happen there is that the single individual stands in an absolute relation to the absolute. Strip that to its structure, and it says, there is a point at which you are answerable, and the general rules cannot take the weight, and no committee can be assembled to share it. I said the 4 variations at the start were there to show what is missing. Here is what is missing. In all 4, in every one of them, Abraham does something that makes him explicable. He becomes a monster to protect his son's faith, or he is destroyed by what he did, or he is guilty afterwards, or he falters. All 4 give you somewhere to stand. The Abraham in the text gives you nowhere. He goes up, he is stopped, he comes down, and the very next thing the Bible tells you is that they returned to Beersheba and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba. He went home and lived there. That is the sentence Kierkegaard cannot get past, and neither should you. Not the knife, the going home afterwards and living, which raises the question the next part is about. Because getting something back after you have truly lost it is not an event that any philosophy before him had a category for. Recollection could not do it. Hope could not do it, because hope never lost it in the first place. He had to invent a word. Part 6. Repetition. This is the least known of his major categories, and I think it is the most useful, and it has been buried partly because the English word is wrong for it. Repetition in ordinary use means doing the same thing again. Monotony. The treadmill. It sounds like the opposite of anything valuable. The Danish is gentagelsen, and the components are closer to taking again. A retaking, receiving something back. The book came out in 1843 days apart from Fear and Trembling under the name Constantine Constantius, a name that means constancy twice over, attached to a man who is about to demonstrate that he does not have any. The argument starts by setting repetition against the oldest idea in Western philosophy. Recollection is Plato. In the Platonic picture, learning is remembering. The soul knew the truth before it arrived here, and the work of a life is to recover what it has forgotten. Everything valuable is behind you, and you are walking backwards towards it. Kierkegaard says recollection is the pagan life view and repetition is the modern one, and the difference is direction. Recollection is a life lived backwards. Repetition is the same life received forwards. And he says the crucial thing about which one makes a person happy, and it is a genuinely strange claim until you sit with it. He says recollection's love is the only happy love, and then immediately undercuts it, because recollection's love is happy precisely by being over. What you recollect cannot disappoint you. It has finished. It is safe. It cannot be taken because it has already been taken. Repetition is riskier because repetition is about something you still have to live in. Then he tests it, and the test is comic, and the comedy is the point. Constantine decides to find out whether repetition is possible by conducting an experiment. He had once taken a trip to Berlin, which was, by his account, perfect, so he goes back to Berlin to have it again. Same city, same lodgings, he goes to the same apartment with the same landlord, same theatre, same farce, and he tries to sit in the same seat, and it is a catastrophe. Not a tragedy, a farce. The landlord has got married, which changes the apartment. The room is different. The theatre performance is not the same, and neither, more importantly, is he. The coffee is wrong. He becomes irritable and pedantic. Everything is technically where he left it, and none of it produces the thing he came for. He concludes that there is no such thing as repetition and goes home. Now, a lesser book would leave it there as a joke about nostalgia. Kierkegaard's move is to make Constantine wrong, and to make him wrong in a way he cannot see, because the experiment was doomed by its design. Constantine tried to arrange a repetition. He tried to produce it by controlling the variables, which means he never actually lost anything. He just went and stood in a place where a good thing had happened before. That is, recollection with travel expenses. Real repetition in this book requires that you first genuinely lose the thing, not set it aside, lose it. Which is why the second half of the book is not about Constantine at all. It is about a young man who comes to him for advice, and the young man's situation is this. He is in love, he is engaged, and he has realized that he cannot go through with it. Not because he does not love her, he does completely, but because he has discovered that the relationship has turned him into a poet rather than a husband. He is already writing about her instead of living with her, and he knows what that means. And Kierkegaard was writing this while trying to work out whether he could get Regine Olsen back. Let me give the facts, because they are worse than the version usually told. He met Regine Olsen when she was 14. He proposed when she was 18 and he was 27, in September 1840. She accepted, and by his own account the trouble started the following day. He writes that he saw immediately that he had made a mistake, and that a man who repented of an engagement the day after making it was not going to make anyone happy. He spent about a year trying to get out of it in a way that would leave her intact, and the method he chose was to make himself contemptible. He behaved coldly. He acted the scoundrel. The idea was that she should be the one to break it, and that her family should be able to say she was well rid of him, so that the damage landed on him rather than on her. It did not work, because she fought for it. She begged him not to leave. She invoked her father. And in the end he did the thing anyway, sent back the ring, ended it, and left for Berlin, where he wrote the first draft of either/or at enormous speed. Whether he was right is a question people have argued about for 170 years, and I am not going to settle it in a video. What I will say is that his own account in the journals is not the account of a man who thinks he was clever. It is the account of a man who believes he did something necessary and monstrous, and who never stopped writing about it in code. Now, the mechanics of the book, which is where this becomes almost unbearable. Repetition is, at bottom, Kierkegaard asking whether the thing he destroyed could be given back to him, whether a man can genuinely lose something and then receive it again and have it be the same thing and not a consolation. The book's answer, in the version he had drafted, was going to hinge on the young man's situation resolving, and while it was in production, Kierkegaard learned that Regine had become engaged to Johann Friedrich Schlegel, a man she had known before him, and whom she married a few years later. So the actual world had returned a verdict on the question the book was asking, and the verdict was no. And he rewrote the ending. In the version that was published, the young man does not get her. What happens instead is that she marries somebody else, and the young man is thereby released, and he receives himself back. He gets his own life returned to him, and Constantine, who has understood nothing, is left with a resolution he cannot account for. That is one of the strangest things I know about in the history of philosophy. A book about whether you can receive something back, being overtaken by events that answer its own question in the negative, and being revised at the printer so that the answer is, you do not get the thing back, you get yourself back. And it is not a cheat, because it is exactly what the category always required, which he makes explicit by naming the person who actually achieves repetition, and it is not the young man, and it is certainly not Constantine. It is Job. Job loses everything, children, property, health, and he does not accept it quietly. That is the part Kierkegaard insists on, because the pious reading of Job is that he was patient, and Kierkegaard says the opposite. Job's greatness is that he protests. He will not accept his friends' explanations, which are all versions of you must have deserved it. He holds his ground and demands an answer, and the demand itself is the faith. And at the end, Job gets everything back twofold. Now, it is not the same livestock. They are not the same children. On the ledger, it is a replacement, and it should be worthless as a consolation. Anyone who has lost a person knows that a replacement is an insult. Kierkegaard's reading is that what Job receives back is not the property. It is his life as his, again, having been through the total loss of it, and having refused to pretend the loss was fair. That is the repetition, the same existence handed back after it was actually gone. So the category, stated plainly, repetition is receiving your own life again, as new, having genuinely lost it. And notice what it is not. It is not nostalgia, which is recollection wearing a nice coat. It is not resilience in the modern sense, which usually means absorbing damage and continuing. It is not moving on. Moving on is the substitution of a new object. Repetition is the same object, returned. It is also not available on demand, which is why Constantine's trip fails and why the whole first half of the book is a comedy. You cannot schedule it. You cannot go to Berlin and get it. The precondition is a real loss, and nobody arranges one of those. There is one more thing to say here, and it connects this video to the one before it. About 40 years after this, Friedrich Nietzsche, who as far as anyone can establish never read Kierkegaard, and who was told about him too late to do anything with it, arrived at a question with the same shape from the other side. His was, if you had to live this exact life again, every detail, endlessly, would that be a crushing weight, or the best news you had ever heard? Eternal recurrence. They are cousins. Both are asking whether you can affirm the life you actually have in its own terms, rather than a better one. Nietzsche asks it as a test you apply to yourself. Kierkegaard asks it as something you undergo and cannot arrange. Nietzsche's answer is amor fati, love of fate. Say yes to the whole thing. Kierkegaard's is repetition, lose the whole thing and be given it back. If you have watched the Nietzsche video on this channel, you have the other half of a conversation that neither man knew he was having. Now, I have used the pseudonyms as a convenience for 2 hours. Johannes the Silent said this, Constantin Constantius did that, Anticlimacus wrote the other. It is time to explain why they exist, because it is not a quirk. It is the most consistent methodological decision he ever made, and it is aimed directly at you. Part 7. The author who refused to be one. Here is a partial list of the people who wrote Kierkegaard's books. Victor Eremita edited either/or, having found the papers in a desk he attacked with a hatchet. Inside those papers, A wrote the first volume and Judge William wrote the second, and within A's papers a further character, Johannes the Seducer, wrote a diary that A claims he merely found. That is 3 layers of authorship inside one book, and none of them is Kierkegaard. Johannes the Silent wrote Fear and Trembling and states in it that he is not a philosopher and that he does not have faith. Constantine Constantius wrote Repetition and concluded, wrongly, that repetition is impossible. Vigilius Haufniensis, the watchman of Copenhagen, wrote The Concept of Anxiety. Hilarious bookbinder assembled Stages on Life's Way. Frater Taciturnus contributed to it. Johannes Climacus wrote Philosophical Fragments and the enormous concluding unscientific postscript, and says of himself in print that he is not a Christian. Anticlimacus wrote The Sickness unto Death and Practice in Christianity, and is a Christian to an extraordinary degree, higher than Kierkegaard placed himself. And at the end of the postscript, Kierkegaard appended something called a first and last declaration, in which he acknowledges that he is the author of all of it, and then asks the reader not to attribute a single word of it to him. He writes that his relation to these books is that of a reader, not an author. He asks that if anyone quotes them, they quote the pseudonym by name, not him. People read that as coyness, or as a legal maneuver, or as the eccentricity of a man who liked games. It is none of those. It is a method, and it follows directly from something he believed about what kind of thing a truth about living is. His position is this: there are truths you can transmit. The boiling point of water, the date of a battle, the rule for the area of a circle. I can hand these to you, and you now have them, and the handing over is complete. Whether I am a good person or a fraud makes no difference to whether the information arrived. And then there are truths that only exist in the doing. What it is to be honest, what it is to love somebody, what it is to have actually chosen your life rather than drifted into it. These cannot be handed over, because there is no state of affairs in which you possess one and are not doing it. His term for the difference is direct and indirect communication, and his objection to direct communication in this second domain is not that it fails, it is worse than that. It appears to succeed, and that appearance is the damage, because the moment you receive it as information, you have converted a thing that had to be done into a thing you now know. And a person who knows about courage and has that knowledge sitting neatly in place is in a worse position than a person who has never heard of it, because the slot is filled. He has the answer. There is nothing outstanding. So Kierkegaard's problem, as a writer, is how do you say something that cannot be said without the saying of it ruining the thing? And his solution is to remove himself as an authority. Watch what the pseudonyms actually do. They present positions from inside. A does not have the aesthetic life explained about him by a narrator who disapproves. A gets the microphone, and he is funnier and sharper than his opponent. Johannes the Silent does not lecture you about faith from above. He says he does not have it and cannot understand Abraham, and then walks around the problem for 200 pages being defeated by it. Johannes Climacus writes hundreds of pages about Christianity while stating he is not a Christian. Every one of them is missing the thing they are describing. That is the design. They cannot hand you the conclusion because they do not have it. And with no author to defer to, there is nobody to agree with. You cannot resolve the book by deciding Kierkegaard is right. There is no Kierkegaard in it. The 2 volumes of either or do not come with a verdict, and there is no editor's note explaining which life is correct, and Victor Eremita specifically declines to help. The reader is left holding the choice, which is precisely the subject of the book. This is a machine, and its function is to prevent you from converting the work into an opinion you hold. He has a term for what he is doing, and he takes it from Socrates, whom he admired above everyone. He calls himself a midwife. Socrates claimed he taught nothing and had no doctrine, and that his skill was in delivering what was already in the other person. Kierkegaard's version is more elaborate and considerably more devious, but the principle is the same. He is not trying to install a belief. He is trying to put you in a position where you have to do something. There is a second reason for the masks, and it is less flattering, and he was candid about it. Kierkegaard did not think he was qualified. Anticlimacus is the clearest case. That name is not the opposite of Climacus in the sense of enemy. The ladder metaphor is in play, climax being a ladder in Greek. Climacus is at the bottom, a man climbing, not a Christian. Anticlimacus is at the top, and Kierkegaard says in his journals that he placed himself between them, higher than Climacus and lower than Anticlimacus. He wrote the most demanding Christian books of the century and then declined to sign them on the grounds that if he signed them, he would be presenting himself as someone who lived that way, and he did not. That is not false modesty. It is a very precise refusal to let the work certify the man, and it means the most exacting statements in his authorship are delivered by a character who is explicitly held up as beyond the author, which keeps the demand at full strength while removing the possibility of pointing at the writer and asking whether he manages it himself. Now, in fairness, there is a cost to all this, and it is worth being honest about it. The method is why he was ignored for 50 years. He wrote in Danish, a language with a small readership. He published under invented names. He refused to state a doctrine, and the works actively resist summary, because summary is the operation the whole design exists to defeat. It took a German translation and the collapse of a certain kind of 19th century optimism for anyone outside Denmark to notice. And when they did notice, the thing he built to protect the work stopped protecting it, because the world's response to an author who will not give you a doctrine is to extract one anyway. That is exactly how we ended up with Leap of Faith. the phrase he never wrote, doing the job he spent his life refusing to do. He also ran a second authorship the whole time, and this is the part that gets left out. Alongside the pseudonymous books, he was continuously publishing what he called upbuilding discourses under his own name, no masks, direct address, religious in content, published to coincide with the pseudonymous works, often on the same day. He described the arrangement with a spatial image. The pseudonymous works were the left hand, the discourses the right, and he said the world reached out for what was in the left hand. So the picture of Kierkegaard as a man who only ever spoke through masks is wrong. He signed his name to a great deal. What he would not sign was the material that made a demand he had not personally met. And the discourses are where you find the plainest sentence he ever wrote about what all of this is for. It is the title of one of them from 1847, "Purity of heart is to will one thing." It sounds like a motto for a poster. And then he spends the whole discourse taking it apart, and the taking apart is the substance. Because he says double-mindedness is the default, not the exception, the normal operating condition of a human being. And he catalogues the ways you can will one thing and still be double-minded, and they are uncomfortable. You can will the good for the sake of the reward. Then you are not willing the good. You are willing the reward, and the good is a root. You can will the good out of fear of punishment. Same structure, different sign. You can will the good in order to be the kind of person who wills the good, which he treats as the most sophisticated version and the hardest to detect, because from the outside it is indistinguishable from the real thing, and from the inside it feels like integrity. And you can will the good only up to a point, which he says is not a partial success but a different act entirely, because a reservation changes what the willing is. That is the same structural move as everything else in this video. Despair is not a feeling, it is a misrelation. Anxiety is not fear, it is the shape of freedom. Faith is not a belief you hold, it is a way the self is standing. And purity of heart is not sincerity or intensity, it is a matter of whether there is one thing or two in the act. Which brings us to the last year of his life, when he stopped using masks entirely, stopped being indirect, and spent everything he had on a single direct accusation. Part 8. The Attack. To understand the last year, you need to know what Denmark was. It was a country with a state church. Lutheran, established, funded by the state, its clergy paid as officials. Essentially, the entire population was baptized into it as infants. To be Danish was to be Christian, and it was administrative rather than chosen. You did not join, you were entered. And Kierkegaard's final accusation is not that the doctrine is false. He does not attack a single article of belief. His accusation is that this arrangement has abolished Christianity by making it free. His term for the arrangement is Christendom, and he separates it from Christianity with total severity. Christianity, in his account, is a demand that costs you your life in the sense that it reorganizes it. Christendom is the situation in which everyone already has it, at birth, at no cost, with no decision. And his charge is that the second one does not spread the first. It replaces it. And it is a more effective way of getting rid of Christianity than persecution ever was. Because a persecuted faith requires you to choose it, and an automatic one removes the moment where anything is chosen. He puts the mechanism in a phrase I keep coming back to. Christendom has taken away from Christianity the offense, meaning the difficulty, the thing that makes you stop. Remove the offense, and you have not made the thing easier to accept. You have made it into something there is nothing to accept, because acceptance requires an alternative. Now hold that against everything in the previous 7 parts, and notice that it is the same argument again in the largest possible frame. The aesthete refuses to choose. The crowd is a machine for having no one choose. Direct communication converts a thing you must do into a thing you know. And Christendom is an entire national arrangement in which the most demanding decision available to a human being has been pre-completed on their behalf before they could speak. His whole life's work has one enemy, and the enemy is not error. It is the preempted decision. He held his fire for years, and the reason was a person. Bishop Jacob Peter Münster had been his father's pastor. Kierkegaard had known him since childhood, had genuine affection for him, and had criticized the church around him without ever going at him directly while he lived. He said as much. While Münster lived, he would not. Münster died in January 1854. And at the memorial, Hans Lassen Martensen, who would succeed him as bishop, and who was a professor of the exact kind of system-building theology Kierkegaard had spent a career attacking, eulogized Münster as a witness to the truth. He placed him in the line running from the apostles and the martyrs. That phrase is what detonated it. Because for Kierkegaard, a witness to the truth is a specific and terrible category. It means someone whose life was spent in poverty and rejection for the thing, someone scourged, someone who died for it. And Münster had been a decorated senior official of a state church, a man of rank and comfort and enormous social standing who had died in his bed as one of the most respected men in Denmark. Kierkegaard's point is not that Münster was a bad man. It is that if that life is what a witness to the truth looks like, then the words have been emptied, and the emptying of those words is precisely the thing he had been describing for 15 years, now performed at a state funeral by the incoming bishop out loud. He waited almost a year, and then he published, and then he did not stop. It began in the newspaper Fædrelandet, the Fatherland, with an article asking whether Münster was a witness to the truth, and it escalated over about 20 pieces. Then in May 1855 he started publishing his own broadsheet, and he called it Øjeblikket, the moment or the instant, and the word matters. It is his term for the point at which the eternal touches a life, and something has to be decided. 9 issues came out. A 10th was written and found among his papers. And the tone is nothing like the rest of the authorship. The pseudonyms are gone. The irony is gone, or rather, it has been sharpened into something without any play in it. He is direct, he is repetitive, he is deliberately crude, and he is very funny in a way that is difficult to read. He tells the reader that the way to be rid of Christianity is not to attack it, but to have every clergyman in the country be a civil servant with a pension. He says that the state's Christianity is a forgery, and that its clergy are, in the plainest terms, tradesmen selling a product they have made harmless. He asks people to stop taking part, to refuse to call themselves Christian on the grounds that the honest position is to admit you are not one rather than to hold a title issued at birth. That last one is the demand that made the attack a scandal rather than a controversy. He was not asking anyone to convert, he was asking them to stop claiming something free. He also spent his money down to nothing, and the timing is either remarkable or intentional, and nobody can prove which. He had inherited a substantial sum from his father, and had lived on it his entire adult life, publishing at his own expense, never holding a job. He had calculated, apparently more than once, roughly how long it would last. He drew close to the last of it in the autumn of 1855, having spent the final portion on printing The Moment. On the 2nd of October, he collapsed in the street. He was taken to Frederick's Hospital, and he did not leave it. He was there for about 6 weeks. His friend Emil Boesen, who was a clergyman, visited and kept notes, and those notes are among the most human documents in the whole story. Kierkegaard was lucid. He talked about his life, about his father, about Regine. He said his life had been a great, to others unknown and unintelligible, suffering. He said he had been engaged and that things had not worked out, and that this was why the story with Regine had gone as it had. Boesen asked whether he could pray, and he said yes. And he said he prayed first for the forgiveness of sins, then that he might be free of despair at the time of his death, and then, this is the line that stays with me, that he might know a little in advance when death was to come. And Boesen, being a pastor, offered him communion. Kierkegaard refused, not because he had lost his faith. He was explicit that he had not. He refused because Boesen was a priest of the state church, and he said he would take it from a layman. He would not take it from an official. Boesen pointed out reasonably that this would be difficult to arrange. Kierkegaard did not move. He said he had made his choice, and that the clergy were royal functionaries, and royal functionaries have nothing to do with Christianity. He died on the 11th of November, 1855, at 42. And then the last thing, which he did not choose and which is almost too neat. The funeral was held in the Church of Our Lady, the cathedral, run by the institution he had spent his last year calling a forgery. His brother, Peter Christian, a clergyman, later a bishop, gave the address. And at the graveside, his nephew, Henrik Lund, a young doctor, interrupted the proceedings and read out passages from The Moment in public and protested that the church had no right to bury a man who had renounced it. There was a scene. Lund was subsequently fined. So the man who wrote that the crowd is untruth, and who spent a lifetime addressing a single individual, was buried by the institution he had denounced in front of a crowd at an event that turned into exactly the kind of public disturbance he had made himself notorious for analyzing. There is no tidy verdict to draw from that, and I am not going to manufacture one, but it is worth registering what he actually spent it all on, because it was not a doctrine. He did not go to war over whether God exists. He went to war over whether anything had been decided. His accusation against Christendom is structurally identical to his accusation against the aesthete who will not commit, the crowd that dissolves responsibility, and the reader who converts a demand into an opinion. In every case, the complaint is the same. A person has been placed in a position where the most important thing about them is settled without their having done anything, and everyone involved is comfortable, and no one is lying. That is the shape of his entire body of work, and it is why he is still difficult, and it is why he had to die broke, having annoyed everyone, refusing a wafer from a friend. Coda. There is a line of his that everybody knows, and it is nearly always used to end things on a note of gentle wisdom. It is philosophically true that life must be understood backwards. But then one forgets the other clause, that it must be lived forwards. It comes from a journal entry in 1843, and the way it is usually quoted stops right there, and what it seems to say is something calm. Hindsight is clear, foresight is not. Be patient with yourself. Read the whole entry, and it is not calm at all. He is complaining. His point is that this arrangement is the reason no life can ever be fully understood in time, because understanding requires standing still and looking back, and you are never permitted to stand still. There is no vantage point. By the time the shape of a thing is visible, you are already somewhere else, doing the next thing, with no more information than you had before. He is not offering you consolation. He is telling you that you will be required to act without the thing that would make acting safe permanently, and that this is not a phase you are going through, which is, in the end, the whole of it. Let me put the pieces back together, because they are one machine. The self is not something you have. It is a relating, a continuous act of holding together what you could be and what you unchangeably are. That activity can be performed out of true, and when it is, he calls it despair, and it does not have to feel like anything at all. Which is why the version that attracts no attention, the man whose life is working, who has never had the thought, is the version he considered most serious. The feeling that guards the entrance to that work is anxiety, and it is not fear, because it has no object. It is what your own possibility feels like before you have used it, and there is a pull in it as well as a dread, and the presence of it is not evidence that something is wrong with you, it is evidence of the faculty. The more of a person you are, the more of it there is. The easiest way to avoid the whole business is to organize your life around what is interesting, which works, and then requires an escalating maintenance schedule, and then quietly runs out. The most efficient way to avoid it is to be in a crowd, because a crowd is a machine for dividing responsibility until nobody has enough of it to be answerable, and a self is made of exactly that. And when a decision is genuinely yours, you will not be able to explain it. not because you are hiding, but because the reasons you can give will be true and will not be why, and you will walk for 3 days beside people who trust you, carrying something you cannot put into a sentence. What he says is available on the other side is not happiness. He is quite consistent about this, and it is one of the reasons I trust him. It is repetition, your own life, given back after you have actually lost it. Not a better life, not a different one, that one. Now, I have spent 2.5 hours on a man who was a Christian, who believed the power the self must rest in is God, and who would have regarded a version of his thought with that removed as a very elegant misunderstanding. I have not pretended otherwise, and you should not let anyone sell you a Kierkegaard with the difficulty sanded off. That is Christendom by other means, which is the thing he died attacking. But I do not think you have to share his conclusion to be caught by the structure, because the structure makes a claim you can test. It says a self cannot found itself, that the project of being entirely self-authored, answerable to nothing you did not choose, is not brave but incoherent, because the author would have to exist before it wrote itself. Everyone is resting on something. The only question is whether you know what it is, and whether you are at war with the fact that you did not make it. That is checkable. You can look at your own life and find the places where you are pretending to be your own source, and the places where you have quietly handed the whole question to a group so that nobody has to hold it, and the places where you have made everything provisional so that nothing has to be chosen. He would say the finding is the beginning, not the fixing, the finding, because a misrelation cannot be corrected until it has been noticed. And the deepest form of the trouble, the one he built an entire book around, is precisely the form in which nothing has been noticed and everything is fine. He is buried in a cistern cemetery in Copenhagen. He wanted at one point only one thing on the stone. Not philosopher, not author, not any of the 8 names he published under. That single individual, which is not a tribute to himself, it is the last instruction. It is addressed to whoever is standing there reading it one at a time with nobody else in the room. Thank you for watching. If this held you for 2.5 hours, the Nietzsche film on this channel is the other half of a conversation these two never got to have. Kierkegaard asking whether a lost life can be given back, Nietzsche asking whether you would take the same one again forever, by choice. Some lessons do not help you sleep, they wake you up.